In the history often written by the victors, Marina Mnishek is frequently portrayed as a tragic figure, a foreigner cast by fate into the maelstrom of the Russian time of troubles, a mere pawn in others' political games. However, this version is merely a convenient myth, concealing a far more sordid and ambitious truth. She was no innocent victim of circumstance. Rather, she was one of the principal actors, unprincipled in her performance on the stage of Russia's greatest tragedy. Born into a noble but not exceedingly wealthy Polish family, Marina absorbed from a young age the spirit of adventurism and calculating intrigue that pervaded the court of her father, Jerzy Mniszek, the Voivode of Sandomierz. She did not merely observe his ambitious schemes, she became an active participant. When False Dmitry I appeared on the horizon, proclaiming himself a miraculously saved Tsarevich, Marina saw in him not just a potential husband but also the key to unprecedented power. She consented to this risky marriage, fully aware that she was entering a grand deception where the Russian crown was at stake. She arrived in Moscow not as a demure bride, but as an arrogant queen, unwilling to embrace local customs. Her coronation, conducted according to the Catholic rite, was an unprecedented challenge to Russian traditions, and her behavior a blatant provocation, demonstrating contempt for Russian ways. She did not become a meek Tsarina, but remained a haughty Polish aristocrat, looking down upon her new subjects. When the impostor was overthrown and killed, Marina did not break. Instead, her lust for power only intensified. She clung to the title of Russian Tsarina, even while a captive. Her story is not a fairy tale of an unfortunate princess, but a chronicle of a persistent, at times ruthless, struggle for a crown she believed was hers by right, albeit obtained through deceit. She was not merely a hostage of the crown. She was its obsessed and dangerous possessor. This obsession was not born within the Kremlin walls, nor did it arrive with her first step onto Muscovite soil. Its roots ran far deeper, into the very core of her upbringing, in the atmosphere that prevailed in the home of her father, Jerzy Mniszek, the Voivode of Sandomierz. The Mniszek court was more than just a family abode. It was a veritable school of political intrigue, a laboratory for refining ambitious plans, where every day was a lesson in survival and advancement. From a young age, Marina observed how her father, a seasoned player on the grand chessboard of European politics, wove intricate webs of intrigue, deftly forging and ruthlessly breaking alliances, navigating between powerful magnates and the capricious whims of the king. For the Mniszek family, whose nobility and prestige often far outstripped their actual financial means, any opportunity, even the riskiest, to rise in stature was perceived as an absolute, vital necessity. They lived in constant, exhausting tension between ostentatious external splendor and deeply hidden, agonizing need. This precarious position fostered a particular, almost predatory pragmatism, a philosophy where moral principles yielded to cold calculation. Marina imbibed this philosophy from her earliest years. The world was a vast chessboard, and people were merely pieces to be skillfully and ruthlessly moved. Her education, at first glance, was typical for a noble Polish aristocrat. Impeccable knowledge of several languages, refined court etiquette, elegant dances, and the basics of music and painting. Yet beneath these outward proprieties lay a far more valuable and dangerous science, the art of manipulation, the ability to discern and exploit others' weaknesses, and an absolute mastery of survival in a world where reputation, influence, and boundless power were the sole measures of success. She was not simply taught to be a beautiful and obedient bride destined for an advantageous marriage. She was trained to be a formidable rival, capable of outmaneuvering any man on his own ground, using her femininity not as a weakness but as a sophisticated weapon. In her mind, shaped by these harsh lessons, there was no room for sentimentality, moral dilemmas, or empty illusions when it came to achieving power. She witnessed how fragile power was, how easily one could lose everything if not ruthless enough, clever enough, swift enough. Perhaps it was this constant observation of the struggle for survival in the highest echelons of society, rather than any specific personal trauma in the usual sense, that became the unshakable foundation upon which her boundless, all-consuming ambition grew. She was not a naive girl dreaming of a mythical prince on a white horse. She was a calculating, cold-blooded heiress to a family philosophy that viewed marriage not as a union of hearts, but solely as a strategic alliance opening the path to new heights. Thus, when False Dmitry II appeared, her decision to tie her fate to his was not a hasty, impulsive act. It was the logical, inevitable culmination of many years of training, observation, and a profound understanding of the laws of this cruel world. She did not merely believe in his legend of miraculous salvation. She chose to believe in it because it offered her a direct path to the Russian crown, to unimaginable power. This was not an act of blind faith or naivete, but a cold, cynical, and precisely calculated move that left no room for doubt. The point of no return for Marina Mnishek came not when she agreed to marry the impostor, but when she consciously, with full understanding of the risks, accepted the rules of a game where lies, mystification, and deception were not just permissible tools, but the very foundation of her future grandeur. She did not merely participate in a grand fraud. She became its living embodiment, its most valuable, most dangerous trump card. Her personality was forged not so much by lofty dreams as by the harsh, merciless realities of the Polish political arena, where only the most cunning, the most audacious, and the utterly unprincipled survived and prospered. She learned not only to survive but to dominate in this ruthless environment, transforming her traditionally passive female role into an active one, using her beauty, sharp intellect, and complete lack of moral boundaries as a deadly weapon. These deep roots, embedded in the calculating and all-consuming ambitious soil of her childhood, explain the incredible, almost maniacal tenacity and ruthlessness with which she subsequently clung to the phantom of the Russian crown. She was not a victim of circumstance. She was the perfect product of a system that valued power above all else, and she learned this lesson better than anyone. By the early 17th century, the Russian Tsardom was a wounded, bleeding entity, plunged into a profound crisis that was far more comprehensive than a mere change of dynasties. Ivan the Terrible's death left behind not only a devastated country, but also a precarious legacy, and the death of his childless son, Fyodor Ivanovich, definitively severed the centuries-old Rurikid dynasty. Power passed to Boris Godunov, a figure who, despite his undeniable talents, was never perceived as a legitimate, natural sovereign. A boyar, not a descendant of ancient czars, sat on the throne, breeding deep distrust fueled by constant rumors and suspicions surrounding the mysterious death of Tsarevich Dmitry in Uglich. The legitimacy of power hung by a thread, and any upheaval could plunge it into an abyss. However, political instability was only one facet of the impending catastrophe. At the dawn of the new century, Russia was struck by a famine of unprecedented scale. For 3 consecutive years, from 1601 to 1603, crop failures ravaged the land, turning fertile fields into barren wastelands. Winters were abnormally harsh, summers short and cold, and even seeds sown in spring failed to sprout. Grain prices soared hundreds of times over. Cities became depopulated, and peasants, deprived of their livelihoods, fled their lands, becoming vagrants and brigands. According to contemporary accounts, people ate grass, tree bark, and even human flesh. Millions perished, and the country descended into chaos where everyone was for themselves, and law and order lost all meaning. This economic catastrophe, superimposed on a political vacuum, created a unique social atmosphere, a mixture of despair, mystical expectations, and a deep, almost religious yearning for a miracle. The people, exhausted by hunger, disease, and tyranny, sought salvation not in earthly power, which had proven its inadequacy, but in divine providence. In these conditions, rumors of a miraculously saved Tsarevich Dmitry, the legitimate heir who would soon return to restore justice and feed his people, fell on incredibly fertile ground. This was not just hope. It was the last straw for millions of people ready to believe any tale, as long as it promised deliverance from unbearable suffering. The country, it seemed, was waiting for its savior, no matter who he truly turned out to be. This pervasive, almost palpable atmosphere of hopelessness and mystical expectation created the ideal conditions for the most audacious deception in the history of the Russian Tsardom. Into this fertile ground stepped the man who called himself the miraculously saved Tsarevich Dmitry. He appeared seemingly out of nowhere, fueled by rumors and supported by Polish magnates, among whom Marina's father, Jerzy Mniszek, played a pivotal role. For the Mniszeks, whose financial ambitions always exceeded their actual capabilities, this adventurer became not just a tool, but the living embodiment of their long-standing scheme to penetrate Russian affairs. Marina, as we have already seen, was not merely a pawn in this game. She was its main stake, its public face, its living proof. Her consent to marry a man whose origin was more than questionable was not an act of naive faith. It was a cold, calculated step designed to legitimize a grand machination, to give it royal luster and the undeniable appearance of truth. The first grand deception, in which Marina played a central role, unfolded rapidly. False Dmitry, supported by Polish detachments and the gentry, marched on Moscow. His path was paved not only with fire and sword, but also with the astonishing, almost mystical faith of the Russian people, exhausted by famine and anarchy. The overthrow and mysterious death of Boris Godunov, and then his son Fyodor, cleared the impostor's path to the throne. In June 1605, False Dmitry I solemnly entered Moscow, and in May 1606, Marina Mnishek arrived in the capital to become the Russian Tsarina. Her coronation, conducted according to the Catholic rite, became a public act of defiance, a demonstration of contempt for Russian traditions, and a clear sign that this Polish aristocrat had no intention of assimilating. She was a queen, but a foreign, arrogant queen, who did not conceal her true goal: to use Russia for her own, Polish interests. However, this audacious deception lasted on the Russian throne for little more than 11 months. The discontent of the boyars, outraged by Polish dominance and the new Tsarina's arrogance, as well as the exposure of the impostor's true nature, led to an uprising. In May 1606, False Dmitry I was killed, and Marina, miraculously escaping the massacre, found herself a captive. It seemed like the end of ambitions, the end of dreams of the crown. But it was precisely here that the incredible, almost maniacal tenacity we discussed became apparent. Marina did not break. She did not renounce the title of Tsarina, even while under arrest in Yaroslavl and then Kostroma. She continued to cling to it, seeing in it not merely a symbol of lost power, but a living right that, in her deep conviction, belonged to her. And when a new impostor appeared on the horizon, known as False Dmitry II, or the Tushino thief, Marina saw in him not just another swindler, but her second, perhaps last, chance. The second grand deception, in which Marina Mnishek once again found herself at the center of events, unfolded in 1608. False Dmitry II, a man of unknown origin, began to gather discontented individuals and adventurers around him. His appearance was driven not only by the unquenchable belief in the miraculous salvation of the Tsarevich, but also by political intrigues aimed against the new Russian Tsar, Vasily Shuisky. Marina, while imprisoned, did what seemed unthinkable. She recognized this new impostor as her miraculously saved husband. This was pure hypocrisy, a public farce that nevertheless held colossal significance for the legitimation of the second False Dmitry. In August 1608, after complex negotiations and hypocritical oaths, Marina was brought to the Tushino camp, where her secret wedding to the Haiti Tushino thief took place. She did not merely marry a new impostor, she consciously and repeatedly plunged into the maelstrom of deceit, becoming a symbol and living proof of his royal origin. In Tushino, in a camp that became Russia's alternative capital, Marina lived as a true queen. Passions seethed around her, intrigues were woven, and the fates of thousands were decided. She was the Tushino Tsarina, a figure who lent legitimacy to this rebellious court. She bore children, one of whom, Ivan, known as the Little Thief, later became another, albeit tragic, symbol of the time of troubles. Her life in Tushino was full of dangers, intrigues, and a constant struggle for influence. When the Tushino camp collapsed under pressure from Swedish and Russian forces, Marina, along with the remnants of the Tushinoites, fled, never abandoning her obsession with the crown. She was not merely a hostage of circumstances, she was a hostage of her own insatiable lust for power, which pushed her to the most desperate and unprincipled steps, transforming her from the wife of one impostor into the accomplice of another, and ultimately into the mother of a third, doomed to perish. This insatiable thirst for power, which drove Marina Mnishek to the most desperate and unprincipled actions, was bolstered by an astonishing, almost diabolical array of personal qualities and well-conceived strategies that transformed her into a queen not only by title but in essence, a queen of chaos and manipulation. She possessed a unique, constantly refined toolkit that allowed her to survive and even thrive in the most unimaginable circumstances, each time finding new, sometimes shocking paths to the elusive Russian crown. After the death of the first impostor, when all seemed lost, when her own father, Jerzy Mniszek, was captured, and she herself was thrown into a Yaroslavl dungeon, Marina did not despair. On the contrary, she displayed an astonishing, almost instinctive ability to adapt, instantly re-evaluating her strategy. Her captivity was not but merely a pause, a time to regroup and seek a new puppet, a new chance. She did not weep or complain. She waited, carefully analyzing the shifting political landscape and the rumors that reached her from outside. A key element of her arsenal was not merely natural charisma, but a honed mastery of psychological warfare, acquired in her father's home. She understood that in a world where hunger and despair had spawned mystical expectations, where the people's faith in a good czar was unshakable, symbol mattered more than reality, and conviction was stronger than truth. Her recognition of False Dmitry II, the Tushino thief, was not an act of blind faith or naivete, but a brilliant, cynical move that only an absolute pragmatist could devise. She publicly, with demonstrative conviction, recognized him as her miraculously saved husband. This farce, played out with cold calculation and unparalleled hypocrisy, instantly lent the new impostor the necessary legitimacy. The people, exhausted by the time of troubles and yearning for a miracle, received it from the lips of one who had already worn the czarist crown. Her status as Tsarina became a living, breathing argument, irrefutable proof for millions weary of the endless succession of impostors and anarchy. Marina did not simply play a role. She embodied it. Her haughty demeanor, her ability to carry herself as a true queen, even amidst the squalor and chaos of the Tushino camp, created an aura of authenticity around her. She refused to appear pitiful or defeated. Instead, she exuded the very confidence and arrogance that attracted adventurers, ambitious boyars, and disillusioned nobles seeking a new patron and an opportunity to rise. She skillfully played on their greed, their desire for power and wealth, promising them high positions, lands, and untold treasures in the event of ultimate victory. Her court in Tushino, though makeshift, was a precise reflection of her ambitions, a place where the dirtiest intrigues were spun, the boldest promises were made, and where everyone who swore allegiance to the Tushino Tsarina hoped to snatch their piece of the Russian crown. She was a living magnet for all who saw the time of troubles not as a tragedy, but as a chance for personal enrichment and advancement. She was an unparalleled master of creating buzz and managing public opinion, using any available means to do so. Every step she took, every public appearance, even rumors of her pregnancy, were part of a carefully planned spectacle designed to solidify her position and that of the one she supported. She knew how to exploit the mystical sentiments of the people, how to fuel popular expectations, how to transform ordinary events into signs of destiny, confirming her husband's divine origin. Her femininity, which we have already discussed as a sophisticated weapon, was fully deployed here. She was simultaneously a symbol of legitimacy, an object of desire, and a dangerous player capable of overturning any game on the great chessboard of the Russian time of troubles. Her personal capacity for adaptation was evident not only in the astonishing flexibility of her political views and her changing impostor husbands, but also in her readiness for any, even the dirtiest compromises. For her, moral boundaries simply did not exist when it came to achieving her goal. She was prepared to lie, betray, and use anyone who could bring her closer to the coveted throne, be they Polish magnates, Russian boyars, or desperate Cossacks. Her composure in captivity, her categorical refusal to renounce the title of Tsarina, her immediate, cold-blooded reaction to the appearance of the second impostor, all testified to an incredible, almost maniacal will to power that did not wane even in the face of death and complete collapse. She was the embodiment of the predatory pragmatism she had learned from childhood. Marina Mnishek was not merely a participant in the time of troubles. She was its living embodiment, its engine, its catalyst. She did not wait for circumstances to align in her favor. She actively shaped them, utilizing her entire arsenal, from subtle psychological manipulation and cunning intrigue to outright blackmail and cynical deception. She was an actress, director, and protagonist all in one, writing her own role with blood and deceit on the pages of Russian history. Her story is not only a chronicle of mad adventures, but also a profound analysis of how personal qualities, honed in a ruthless school of intrigue and survival, can alter the course of an entire era, transforming an ambitious Polish aristocrat into one of the most dangerous and influential figures of the Russian Interregnum, a true queen of the time of troubles. This queen of the time of troubles, as we have established, was a product of a harsh family schooling, but her ambitions could not have been realized in a vacuum. Behind the audacious machinations of the false Dmitries, behind Marina's every move, stood far more powerful and predatory figures, Polish magnates who saw in Russian instability a goldmine and a key to boundless influence. Her father, Jerzy Mniszek, the Voivode of Sandomierz, was merely one of the architects of this grand scheme, yearning not only for enrichment, but also for the elevation of his family to unprecedented heights. He and his accomplices, such as the Vishnyovyetsky and Mniszech princes, did not merely support the impostor. They invested enormous sums, anticipating a hundredfold return. For them, the Russian Tsardom, weakened by famine and anarchy, was not an object of compassion, but a vast, ripe pie to be divided, using a puppet on the throne. Their goal was not solely economic. They dreamed of political and even cultural domination, of spreading Catholic influence, of transforming Russia into a kind of protectorate. This predatory interest of the Polish gentry was no secret. It was actively fueled by King Sigismund III Vasa of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, whose policy was permeated by the idea of eastward expansion and strengthening Catholic positions. Although Sigismund did not formally support the first False Dmitry directly at the beginning of his campaign, he perfectly understood that the Russian crisis benefited Poland. Every day of the time of troubles, every rebellion, every discord within the Russian boyar class weakened a potential adversary and opened new opportunities for Polish intervention. The king observed the unfolding events like a grand spectacle, ready at any moment to enter the game and reap the fruits of others' efforts. Later, when the situation with the impostors became even more entangled, Sigismund openly intervened, unleashing a full-scale war that led to the occupation of Moscow and an attempt to place his son Władysław on the Russian throne. Marina Mnishek, therefore, was not merely a tool in her father's hands. She was a most valuable asset in a much larger geopolitical game where the future of two great powers was at stake. Her marriage to the impostor was not only a family project, but also part of a carefully planned strategy designed to draw Russia into the orbit of Polish influence. However, this ambitious Polish expansion had a powerful and irreconcilable antagonist, the Russian aristocracy, and primarily the boyar Vasily Shuisky. It was he who became the main driving force behind the coup that overthrew the first False Dmitry, and it was he, relying on the support of a segment of the boyars and Patriarch Hermogen, who ascended the vacant throne. Shuisky represented the old Russian nobility, deeply rooted in Orthodox traditions and categorically unwilling to accept Polish dominance. For him, False Dmitry and Marina were not just impostors, but symbols of foreign invasion, heresy, and the trampling of centuries-old customs. His reign, however, proved extremely fragile. He lacked charisma, was unpopular among the people, and his legitimacy was constantly challenged. He sat on the throne as if on a powder keg, which Marina Mnishek, with her second husband, False Dmitry II, tirelessly sought to ignite. The struggle between Vasily Shuisky and False Dmitry II, supported by Marina, was not merely a fight for the throne. It was a war of civilizations, a clash of two worlds, Orthodox Rus and Catholic Poland, traditional Russian statehood and Western adventurism. Shuisky sought to restore order and legality, relying on old traditions and loyalty to the Rurikid dynasty, even if it had already died out. The impostors, driven by Polish interests and their own ambitions, offered chaos and the destruction of the accustomed way of life, but at the same time they offered hope for miraculous salvation and deliverance from suffering, which resonated with the desperate people. Marina Mnishek, caught between these two forces, did not become a passive victim. On the contrary, she actively fueled this conflict, using her royal legitimacy to mobilize the supporters of False Dmitry II. She was a living banner of an alternative, legitimate power, opposing the boyar Tsar Shuisky. Her presence lent the Tushino camp not merely the status of a rebellious hotbed, but a full-fledged, albeit shadow, capital, where its own history was made, its own decrees were written, and its own justice was meted out. This grand, multi-layered conflict, in which Marina was both an instrument, a player, and a symbol, reached its climax when Swedish troops, summoned by Shuisky to fight the Tushino camp, began to act decisively. In response, Polish King Sigismund III, who had previously acted more cautiously, saw in the Swedish intervention a pretext for open invasion. He moved his troops into Russia, and this marked the beginning of a new, even more bloody stage of the time of troubles. The defeat of the Tushino camp, the flight of False Dmitry II, and his subsequent death, did not signify the end of Marina's struggle. On the contrary, she found herself at the center of a new whirlwind of events, where her former patrons became direct enemies and former enemies. Potential. She was a hostage of the crown, but she also held the throne hostage, constantly adding fuel to the fire of the Russian time of troubles, transforming every political crisis into a personal chance to regain lost greatness. Her story, therefore, was not just a personal drama, but an integral part of a great geopolitical struggle where every figure,